For most of my Destiny career, I've been a Warlock main, but I believe in testing my assumptions. I've decided to evaluate all 15 subclasses in Destiny 2 to see if I actually like more Warlock subclasses than Titan or Hunter. To make sure I gave each subclass a fair shot, I decided to do an experiment. I decided to run the same activity 15 times, once per subclass. I wanted an activity that would be somewhere in the mid-tier difficulty-wise, not as challenging as a Grandmaster Nightfall, but not as easy as an EDZ patrol. I eventually decided to use the Witch Queen Legendary campaign as my testing ground because it has about a mid-tier difficulty, but also doesn't favor any particular subclass like the Lightfall campaign does with Strand. Because it would take a ridiculous amount of time to play the whole campaign 15 times, I narrowed my focus to a singular mission. I tried out a few different missions to see which would be the best in terms of difficulty and length, and eventually settled on the second mission, which is fittingly named The Investigation. Before starting my experiment, I made 15 builds, one per subclass that I hoped would give a decent representation of how the subclass feels to use. I usually opted for a build I thought would be the most powerful or fun to play with. Finally, I banned the use of seasonal artifact mods, as they give advantages to certain classes, which in Season 20, when I performed this test, would be Solar, Strand, and Void. This video will present my findings in the following format. I will explain each build, give my thoughts on the gameplay experience based on both how powerful the build felt, but also how much I enjoyed using it, and finally, give each subclass a grade. The rankings will be solely PvE focused, as I'm not much of a PvP player, so don't feel qualified to take that into account. I'm gonna use the same tier format pretty much everyone uses these days, where S is the best, followed by A, B, C, in decreasing order, and finally F for the worst. At the end of the video, I'm going to break down the full tier list in order from worst to best. This tier list is my opinion, as there is no way to objectively rank something in this kind of format. I'm gonna start this video off with Void Hunter. I used a Gerfalcon's Halbrecht Volatile build. If you're unfamiliar, after the rework, Gerfalcon's grants volatile rounds after exiting invisibility. This means the gameplay loop of the build involves going invisible and then using a void weapon to exit invisibility to take advantage of the extra damage of volatile rounds. Pairing the build with a void SMG and machine gun was a no-brainer because the high rates of fire allow for high uptime of volatile explosions, even post-retrofit escapade nerf. Out of all the subclasses, I think void weapons synergize the best with their builds due to volatile rounds. Most other subclasses don't give you a super strong incentive to use weapons of the same element. Void Hunter is the subclass that makes the most of invisibility as a game mechanic, so it's a very defense and stealth focused subclass. Without any exotics, you can go invisible from dodge, melees, and finishers, so there are lots of ways to evade your enemies. Void Hunter absolutely excels in high-end PvE content, as the invisibility allows you to avoid getting killed by enemies. However, it doesn't always work consistently, as sometimes enemies will still target or kill you while invisible. I can't count the number of times I've heard a hunter complain about being killed while invisible. It happens too much. Gerfalcon's is the best exotic in the game for volatile rounds, so definitely makes the most of one of Void's strongest assets. I enjoyed Void Hunter quite a bit and am putting it in the A tier. It's definitely a solid and fun option, but doesn't feel absolutely busted like some of the other subclasses we'll get to soon. For my Void Titan, I ran a Severance Enclosure Volatile build. This build relies on the exotic's damage buff to Void melees to use them to grant volatile rounds via the controlled demolition aspect. impact. Grenades can also weaken and make targets volatile, so the gameplay loop is about using grenades and melees for damage, finishers to generate void breaches which grant devour healing, and the use of barricade and Ward of Dawn's overshields. Void Titan is a very defensive subclass with lots of ways to grant healing, so it has strong survivability but not quite as much as the invisibility of Void Hunter. I enjoyed Void Titan, but wouldn't say it's quite as good as Void Hunter, even though it's a solid choice, so I'm giving it B tier. For Void Warlock, I ran the Controverse Hold Devour Lock build. Controverse Hold is a good choice for this subclass because it allows you to consume a vortex grenade to grant damage resistance and get grenade energy back upon dealing damage with a grenade. This synergizes incredibly well with the Feed the Void aspect, which grants Devour from grenade kills, giving up to 15 seconds of healing if you use the right fragments. This build is incredibly strong for endgame content as it allows near constant healing and grenade output. It's a very fun build that lets you do some absurd things in high-end content. The other major advantage of Void Warlock is it has one of the best supers in the game in the Nova Bomb variants, which each have their own use cases. I prefer Cataclysm as it's easier to use because it tracks enemies and has slightly higher damage in PvE. However, Vortex is probably slightly better if you're able to aim it correctly every single time. The only downside of Void Warlock is that Pocket Singularity is the only melee ability and the worst one in the game. I know I'm biased towards this class because Void Warlock was the very first subclass I ever used in Destiny 1 and still quite enjoy using Void 3.0 in Destiny 2. It without a doubt is S tier for its strong healing and damage output. Next up is Solar Warlock. Given that I'm making this video in Season of Defiance, you probably could have predicted the build I used. The Starfire Protocol Fusion Grenade build was already strong in the final few seasons of the Witch Queen, but with the changes to the armor mod system and addition of new light subclass fragments with the release of Lightfall, it got even better. The biggest downside of the build pre-Lightfall was the lack of a pervasive source of healing unlike most other solar builds. However, Lightfall made it significantly easier to get Well of Radiance back instantly via grenades using the mod Ashes to Ashes, and also introduced a free source of healing via grenades curing and healing you upon kills. As a result, this build became the strongest in the game. Starfire Protocol gameplay focuses on the primary loop of using an empowering rift or Well of Radiance to grant fast recharge of grenades, using grenade kills for passive healing, and getting your well back with Ashes to Ashes. It's such a perfectly crafted positive feedback loop that both empowers and heals the player. Fusion grenades are already incredibly strong on Warlock as the aspect Touch of Flame causes fusion grenades to explode twice, giving them some of the highest damage in the game. When choosing the order I tried out builds, I front-loaded the testing with the builds I was most familiar with as I knew my knowledge of the mission would increase with each successive run. Thus, Starfire was the first build I tested. It performed as I expected, and it probably won't surprise you to hear that I think Solar Warlock is currently the best subclass in the game at a clear S tier. It's so strong that Bungie will probably nerf Starfire Protocol sometime soon. However, Solar Warlock's strength isn't solely based on that build in particular, as the already very strong Sunbracer's Solar Grenade build will likely take Starfire's place as one of the strongest builds in Destiny 2. In general, Solar is a very strong element, as it has the largest number of self-healing options to play with. I think it'll be a very dominant element in Lightfall unless significant meta changes or nerfs occur. For Solar Titan, I used a Synthoceps Hammer Bonk build. This build takes advantage of Synthoceps' buff to melee damage, which the Throwing Hammer benefits the most from. Throwing Hammer is without a doubt the best melee ability in Destiny 2, and it isn't even close. After each throw of the hammer, it lands on the ground and can be picked up instantly to refresh the ability. This is where the bonk part of the build comes in. The best way to use Throwing Hammer is at point blank, where it will drop at your feet and instantly be picked up, allowing you to throw it again. This allows some ridiculously fast melee spam. With Syntheseps's damage buff and Throwing Hammer's built-in healing via Cure, it's almost impossible to die if you keep killing adds. The only potential downside is the long recharge time if you lose your hammer, but this can be mitigated by building into strength and also melee recharge. The build I made allows you to pretty much get a hammer back instantly if you get a grenade kill, so my loop was spam hammer and then throw a grenade if I lost my hammer. It was extremely effective. I steamrolled the entire Lightfall legendary campaign solo, with the exception of Callus this way on my Titan. This build isn't as strong in something like Grandmaster Nightfalls, but for mid-tier difficulty stuff like raids, dungeons, and legendary campaigns, this build is probably the best in the game. Overall, I have to give Solar Titan an A tier rating, as it's incredibly fun how ridiculously aggressive you can be with it. For Solar Hunter, I used a Claw of Ahamkara Trip Mine build. This build relies on Claw of Ahamkara's enhancement of trip mines after ability damage. This means the gameplay loop is to throw grenades, throw knives to get radiant, dodge to get knives back, throw knives again to get your trip mine back, and repeat. This is a fun build because you can spam abilities pretty much constantly. The only problems with it are the way trip mines work, which is highly directional with less splash damage than most other options. This means you need to be even more precise with your grenade throws than normal. Trip mines can also do quite a bit of self-damage, so they kill you if you use them too close to yourself. The other downside is if you mess up your rotation of abilities, it can take a while for everything to recharge. The build is helped by the strength of Blade Barrage's burst damage, but in general, Solar Hunter is weaker than the other two Solar offerings. I'm giving Solar Hunter an A tier rating. For Arc Hunter, I used an Assassin's Cowl combination blow build. I was very pleasantly surprised by this build. It involves using rapid melees to get a kill, which then makes you invisible and grants healing thanks to Assassin's Cowl. Next, you use Gambler's Dodge to get your melee back, and repeat. The build is incredibly strong and very fun to use because it rewards aggressive gameplay. I was getting into knife fights with Hive Light Bearers on Legend and still winning. It's that good. Add in speed boost and the already strong utility of arc grenades and the Gathering Storm super, and this build makes for a potent and very fun subclass. I don't have a lot else to say because I had an absolute blast with this build and will definitely be bringing it into content in the future. I also am pretty sure I didn't die a single time when using this build, which was fairly rare for my runs. Without a doubt, Arc Hunter is S tier. Going into this video, I was pretty set in the opinion that Arc Warlock was by far the worst Warlock subclass. I think that emotional opinion was created by how garbage both of the class's supers are. After picking the subclass back up and using the Coldheart and Fallen Sunstar Ionic Trace build, I have to admit that I was wrong. I was pleasantly surprised by how fun I found running around with an Arc Soul and spamming Storm Grenades, Ball Lightning, and Coldheart. The neutral abilities of this subclass are incredibly strong, and when paired with Fallen Sunstar and Coldheart, they excel to create a very chaotic but high damage output build. A lot of people sleep on Arc Warlock due to the F tier supers, but it's incredibly potent for ad clear and ability uptime. I would rank Arc Warlock B tier. For Arc Titan, I ran a Heart of Inmost Light Storm Grenade build. Hoyle Titan was one of the strongest builds in the game back in seasons 18 and 19 due to the ridiculous ability recharge rate due to Hoyle's exotic effects and Touch of Thunder's ridiculous buff to Storm Grenades. Post-nerf, Arc Titan is still fairly strong, but it's a lot easier to die from splash damage from your own grenades. It makes this build a lot worse than it used to be, even though it's still fairly decent. Arc Titan also has Thunder Crash, which is one of the strongest burst supers in the game, and is also fun for cheesing jumping puzzles. Overall, I think Arc Titan is a bit on the weaker side, and isn't quite as fun as it would need to be to overcome some of its downsides, so I'm going to give it C tier. For Stasis Warlock, I ran an Osteomancy Stasis turret build. Osteomancy gloves give cold snap grenades an extra charge and added functionality. The intended purpose of the exotic is likely to enable more use of the cold snap grenade. However, this intention is subverted by the Stasis turret build, where Warlocks use the Bleak Watcher aspect to consume the cold snap grenade and turn it into a Stasis turret that shoots ice, slowing and freezing enemies. This is the single best ad clear build in Destiny 2. The player can either have infinite uptime on turrets, or 2 firing at once with a bit of a break in between. The gameplay loop is to throw a turret, use Rift to charge the next one, throw the next one, and repeat. It doesn't even matter that the rest of Warlock's Stasis kit, the Penumbral Blast melee, and Winter's Wrath super are a bit underwhelming, even though they focus on immobilizing enemies. Stasis turrets are so strong that they make the entire subclass one of the most viable options for endgame content. Additionally, the aspect Glacial Harvest provides a source of healing, as freezing enemies generate stasis shards that can be used as a source of healing. I regularly use the Osteomancy build in GMs and raids because it's incredibly useful to slow the enemies down, taking pressure off the team. It's one of the best defensive subclasses in the game, only being outmatched by Solar and Void Warlock. Stasis turrets alone are responsible for Stasis Warlock receiving an A tier rating from me. For Stasis Hunter, I didn't have a strong build in mind, so I went with Dragon Shadow, Grim Harvest, and Shatter Dive. Stasis Hunter has a strong neutral game that barely requires being built into at all, so you can use pretty much whatever exotic you want with it. I used Gambler's Dodge to get melee back quickly, and Grim Harvest to get healing from stasis shards. Shatter Dive is quite possibly the strongest movement-based ability in Destiny 2, and has a lot of situations in which it's quite useful. It's hard for me to categorize Stasis Hunter because it feels like it has a bunch of random useful stuff thrown together, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because it allows you to play the subclass however you want. Silence and Squall is the only good Stasis super in my opinion, and is probably the best roaming super in the game, given that you throw it out and it tracks enemies for free. Overall, I would give Stasis Hunter B tier, because while it's very strong, it doesn't quite have a build that makes it A tier like the Osteomancy build. I know I haven't covered Strand yet, and I'll get there in due time, but I'm not going to leave you in suspense any longer. Stasis Titan is the worst subclass in Destiny 2, full stop. It's the only one that's so bad I would give it a failing F tier. The melee and super are so bad that they actively got me killed when I tried to use them against enemies, which is hilarious in a sad way. I used a Hoarfrost Z Tectonic Harvest Shatter build for my Stasis Titan, but it wasn't useful enough to get a passing grade. Hoarfrost Z converts your barricade into an ice crystal, which is useful for a Tectonic Harvest Shatter build, which grants healing stasis shards from destroying stasis crystals. The healing you get from this method isn't worth the clunkiness it takes to use it. Stasis Titan is just bad and needs to be significantly reworked. At the very least, it needs a major buff to melee and super damage. It's hard to think of a way to fix this subclass because a lot of it just suffers from bad design. Stasis is all about freezing your enemies and using the slow and freeze abilities for crowd control, so trying to make a melee subclass work with it is difficult. To be good, I think Stasis Titan needs a ranged way to freeze enemies, and the emphasis should be on running up and meleeing those frozen frozen enemies to shatter them. It would probably benefit from something like stasis turrets, however, it seems like Bungie wants those to be a Warlock thing. For Strand Warlock, I use the Swarmer's Suspend build, where you take advantage of the Mind Spun invocation aspect that allows you to consume suspend grenades and get 15 seconds of Weaver's Trance. This buff causes suspend bursts to be released from each enemy you kill. This is incredibly strong for ad clear and comes close to Stasis Warlock. The gameplay loop of the build is consume a suspend grenade, kill adds to get a suspend burst, activate your rift to recharge suspend grenade, and repeat. It's similar to Stasis Warlock, but not quite as good as Stasis, because turrets can freeze champions much faster than Weaver's Trance suspends them. Most bosses can't be suspended just like they can't be frozen, but slow still applies, making Strand slightly weaker. I do love the threadling abilities and Warlock super, but they're not quite as good as the Strand Titan and Hunter options. Strand Warlock is a fun defensive build, but falls into B tier, not quite matching Stasis. On my Strand Titan, I use the Abeyant Leap Suspend build. Strand Titans have the Drenger's Lash aspect that sends a suspending projectile out from Barricade. Abeyant Leaf buffs this ability by adding 2 more suspending projectiles and granting Woven Mail's damage reduction buff upon suspending enemies. The gameplay loop is basically alternating between suspend grenades and barricade to immobilize enemies. This makes it easier to suspend targets than Strand Warlock, but has slightly less uptime than Weaver's Trance, which makes Strand Warlock and Titan fairly equal. I would give Strand Warlock a slight edge because it makes better use of tangles and threadlings, but Strand Titan is very close behind. Strand Titan is slightly better for high-level content like raids and GMs, while Strand Warlock is slightly better for mid-tier content. Strand Titan's super is also fun to use as it alternates between light melee attacks and heavy range suspending lashes. Thus, I'm giving Strand Titan B tier. Last but not least, we have Strand Hunter. I used a Radiant Dance Machine's suspend build that takes advantage of the ensnaring slam aspect that gives hunters an air move that allows you to dive into crowds of enemies and suspend them. Radiant Dance Machines allows for extra dodging, so it increases the uptime of this effect. This build isn't quite as good as Strand Warlock or Titan, because Ensnaring Slam is riskier to use than the Suspend Warlock and Titan aspects. You have to get right above your enemies, which is difficult for play spaces without a lot of verticality, which is most of Destiny. This is definitely a fun build, but isn't that great for high-end content. Strand Hunter's saving grace is its increased movement with double grapple and incredibly strong super Silk Strike. The main problem I have with Strand Hunter is that it just feels like a slightly worse version of Stasis Hunter. Thus, I would give it a C tier ranking. Now that we've covered all 15 subclasses, it's time to go over numerical rankings from best to worst. The only F tier subclass is Stasis Titan, the absolute worst class in the game as of Season 20. C tier has 2 subclasses with Strand Hunter and Arc Titan. B tier is the largest tier with Arc Warlock, Stasis Hunter, Void Titan, Strand Titan, and Strand Warlock. A tier has Solar Hunter, Void Hunter, Stasis Warlock, and Solar Titan. Finally, S tier has Arc Hunter, Void Warlock, and the best subclass in the game, Solar Warlock. Warlock remains my favorite class with 2 S tier subclasses, 1 A tier, and 2 B tiers. Hunter is my second favorite with 1 S tier subclass, 2 A tiers, 1 B tier, and 1 C tier. Titan is my least favorite class with 1 A tier subclass, 2 B tiers, 1 C tier, and 1 F tier. Finally, Solar is my favorite element, followed by Void, Arc, and then Stasis and Strand are tied for last. I'm curious to see what other people's tier lists are in the comments of this video. What are your favorite and least favorite subclasses in PvE for Season 20? Which of my rankings do you agree or disagree with the most? If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. I'm eforme and would like to thank you for watching.